Rain soaked through my jacket as I stood frozen in the driveway, staring at an empty concrete slab where my family barn had stood for more than 40 years. The air still smelled like wet dirt and diesel fuel, like the destruction had just happened instead of months ago. Out in the open field, 20 head of cattle huddled together under sagging blue tarps, restless and exposed. No shelter, no feed system, no veterinary supplies. Just mud, stress, and animals depending on me to fix something I didn't even understand yet. I had come home from an 18-month military deployment expecting quiet mornings, routine ranch work, and the kind of peace you only appreciate after being gone too long. Instead, my homecoming looked like a crime scene. I remember turning to my neighbor trying to make sense of it all when he finally said the words that hit harder than anything I faced overseas. The HOA ordered it. They called my barn a safety hazard. I called it what it was, private property destroyed while I was serving my country by people who assumed I would stay quiet. They were wrong. Because I didn't just rebuild that barn, I forced them to rebuild it under court order, on my terms, with consequences attached. And before I tell you how it got there, let me ask you something. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? My name is Ethan Cole, and my family has worked this land outside Red Willow Plains, Wyoming for as long as I can remember. Long before the town had paved roads, long before anyone ever said the letters HOA out loud, my grandfather built that barn with his own hands. My father expanded it years later, and when I came of age, I maintained it. That barn wasn't just a structure. It was the center of daily life on the ranch. Feed storage, equipment, veterinary supplies, shelter when the weather turned ugly. If the ranch had a heartbeat, that barn was it. When I deployed overseas, I left knowing the place would be quiet but standing. I had arranged for basic oversight, paid my dues, and trusted that nothing major could happen while I was gone. 18 months later, all I wanted was to drive home, breathe clean air, and get my hands back into honest work. I imagined unlocking the barn doors, checking the feed bins, and falling back into routines that made sense again. The drive back felt almost unreal. Mile after mile of familiar fencing and open land calmed me in a way nothing else could. I was already planning the repairs I wanted to make, thinking about small upgrades, picturing cattle safe inside when winter rolled through again. Then I crested the final rise before my property, and everything inside me went cold. The barn wasn't damaged. It wasn't leaning or half collapsed. It was gone. At first, my brain refused to process it. I slowed the truck, then stopped completely, staring at the empty slab like it might correct itself if I looked long enough. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. Clean edges, tire tracks, a concrete pad scraped bare. This wasn't a storm. This wasn't decay. This was demolition. The sky darkened as clouds rolled in, and that's when panic replaced shock. I spotted my cattle out in the open field, bunching together like they knew something was wrong. A storm was coming fast, and they had nowhere to go. No roof. No windbreak. No dry ground. I grabbed tarps, fencing scraps, anything I could find, and worked against the clock to create makeshift shelter. Rain started falling before I finished tying the last line. As I worked, more questions hit me. Where was the feed mixer? Where were the veterinary cabinets? The water pumps? The tools I had spent decades collecting? Tens of thousands of dollars in equipment didn't just disappear. That's when Frank Dalton's truck pulled up along the fence line. Frank and his wife Lydia had lived next door longer than I'd been alive. They were the kind of neighbors who kept an eye out without overstepping, the kind you trusted without needing paperwork. The look on Lydia's face told me this conversation had been waiting for months. She said they tried to reach me while I was gone, but military channels weren't exactly cooperative. Then Frank filled in the rest. About 3 months into my deployment, heavy machinery showed up, dump trucks. Loaders, a full crew wearing safety vests and carrying binders. They said they were there on behalf of the Homeowners Association. According to them, the barn was an emergency safety hazard. Frank said the woman in charge introduced herself as Paula Grayson, the HOA president. She spoke confidently, waved documents around, and told anyone who questioned her that the situation had already been reviewed. Lydia remembered the way they worked, methodical and careful, not rushed or panicked. Equipment was removed first. Then the structure came down piece by piece. I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Did anyone stop them? Frank shook his head. They made it sound official, legal. Like fighting, it would only cause trouble. As the rain soaked through my clothes and cattle shifted uneasily behind me, something clicked into place. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't misunderstanding. Nobody accidentally brings heavy equipment onto private ranch land and erases a building that stood for decades. They planned it. They waited until I was gone, and they counted on the fact that I wouldn't be here to stop them. Standing there in the mud, listening to the storm pound down on land my family had protected for generations, I realized something else too. This wasn't just about a barn. This was about someone deciding they had power where they didn't, and believing I would accept it without a fight. The next morning, I did what anyone would do after finding their property erased. I called the sheriff's office. I wasn't angry on the phone. I was calm, deliberate, and clear. I told them a structure on my land had been demolished without my consent while I was deployed, and I needed someone to document it. Deputy Ryan Keller showed up a little after midday. He walked the site slowly, hands on his belt, eyes moving from the empty slab to the torn ground and the temporary shelters I had thrown together for the cattle. He didn't rush. He didn't dismiss me. That gave me a brief sense of relief. But then he found the paperwork. Tucked into a weathered post near the driveway was a plastic sleeve containing a notice stamped with HOA letterhead. Emergency Structure Removal, signed by Paula Grayson. It cited vague safety concerns, structural deterioration, and immediate risk to the community. No dates that made sense. No mention of county permits. Just enough official language to look legitimate to someone who didn't know better. Deputy Keller sighed in a way that told me he'd seen this before. He explained that when paperwork like this exists, especially from an organization claiming authority, it often pushes the situation into civil territory first. That meant lawyers, filings, and time, not handcuffs, not immediate restitution. I asked him point blank if someone could just show up and tear down a building on private land. He said no, not legally, but proving that would take more than his word at the roadside. He filed the report, took photos, logged the missing equipment as under review. Then he gave me a look that said the system was going to move slower than my problems were piling up. That afternoon, I drove straight to the HOA office. The building itself told me a lot. Climate controlled. Clean glass doors. Framed posters about community harmony and shared responsibility. It felt like a different world from the mud and livestock stress I had left behind. Paula Grayson was exactly where I expected her to be, sitting behind a wide desk with neat stacks of folders arranged like armor. She looked up, smiled thinly, and said she had been expecting me. She didn't ask how my deployment went. She didn't express surprise. Instead, she spoke like I was late to an appointment I should have scheduled months ago. She explained, calmly and confidently, that the barn had been flagged as a safety concern during routine inspections. She said they acted out of responsibility, not malice, that they couldn't wait indefinitely for an owner who was unavailable. I reminded her that I was deployed overseas serving the country. She nodded like that was unfortunate but irrelevant. She told me I should be grateful they handled the situation before someone got hurt. That old structures like mine lowered property values and posed risks. She said it like she was doing me a favor. When I asked who gave her authority to act on agricultural land that predated the HOA itself, she deflected. She talked about community standards, about evolving neighborhoods, about progress. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Where was my equipment? Her expression barely changed. She folded her hands and said the contents of the structure were evaluated and disposed of according to protocol. No specifics, no receipts, no locations, just words designed to end the conversation. I pressed harder. Feed systems, veterinary supplies, machinery. Those weren't debris. Those were assets. She told me to take it up with my insurance. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, something colder. The realization that she believed she was untouchable, that the paperwork on her desk was a shield and she was confident it would hold. I left the office feeling smaller than when I walked in, not because I was weak, but because the system felt stacked. Paper against reality. Language against livelihood. A woman who had never shoveled mud or treated an injured animal, deciding what mattered and what didn't. Back at the ranch, rain clouds gathered again. I watched my cattle shift nervously, and I felt the weight of every hour that passed without answers. The HOA wasn't panicking. They weren't scrambling. They were calm because they believed the rules protected them. Standing there, boots sinking into wet ground, I understood something important. They weren't afraid because they thought this was just another complaint that would get buried under forms and delays. They thought paperwork turned destruction into policy. What they didn't realize yet was that paperwork cuts both ways. And I had just started digging. 2 days later, just as I was finishing another round of temporary repairs before nightfall, Frank Dalton pulled into my driveway again. This time, he didn't get out right away. He sat there for a moment, engine idling, like he was deciding whether to hand me something dangerous. When he finally stepped out, he was holding a thick manila envelope and a small flash drive. He didn't say much at first. Just handed them to me and said, "I think this is what you've been looking for." Frank had security cameras on his property line, mostly to keep an eye on coyotes and wandering livestock. He told me he never thought much about them until the day heavy equipment showed up on my land while I was gone. The crew worked close enough to his fence that the cameras caught everything. We went inside, and I plugged the drive into my laptop. The first video made my stomach drop. It showed trucks pulling up in broad daylight. Not rushed, not chaotic, not chaotic. Workers climbed out wearing clean vests and hard hats. They didn't start tearing anything down. They opened the barn doors. What happened next was the moment everything changed. They carried equipment out carefully. My feed mixer lifted with straps like it mattered. Tool chests rolled out intact. Veterinary cabinets removed gently, doors taped shut. This wasn't debris removal. This was inventory. The camera angle shifted, and I saw something else that made my hands shake. One worker slipped while climbing down from a truck, and papers scattered onto the ground. The camera didn't catch what they were at the time, but Frank told me he found a few of them later near the fence line. I opened the envelope. Auction house receipts, dated just days after the demolition. Item categories that matched what I had lost. Agricultural equipment, medical storage, industrial tools. Not scrap, not trash. Assets. I sat there in silence, watching the footage again and again. The way the workers moved, the care they took, the order of operations. Equipment first, structure second, clean execution. That's when it finally clicked. This wasn't an HOA getting carried away with authority. This was theft wearing a safety vest. I thought back to Paula Grayson's words. Disposed according to protocol. At the time, it sounded like bureaucratic nonsense. Now I understood what it really meant. Sold, converted, turned into money. Anger hit me then, but it wasn't wild or reckless. It was focused, controlled. The kind of anger that sharpens instead of blinding. I grabbed my phone and started taking photos. Screenshots of the footage. Close-ups of serial numbers visible on equipment. Shots of the empty slab, the cattle standing in the rain, the makeshift shelters. I laid everything out on the table and started building a timeline. Day 1, demolition. Days later, auction listings. Weeks after that, silence. I cross-referenced dates with my deployment records. I noted when Paula signed the notice, when the equipment disappeared, when the auctions took place. The more I wrote, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't sloppy. It was systematic. Frank told me he remembered the trucks leaving loaded, not empty. He said something about the way they drove off had bothered him at the time, like they were finishing a job they'd done before. At the time, he assumed the HOA knew what it was doing. Now, he realized they were confident because they'd gotten away with it before. That thought sent a chill through me. If they had done this to me, who else had they done it to? I drove back to the sheriff's office with copies of everything. Deputy Keller listened more carefully this time. He didn't interrupt. He didn't brush it off as civil. When I showed him the receipts, his posture changed. When I showed him the footage, his jaw tightened. He told me this moved things into a different category: theft, fraud, potential conspiracy. He still couldn't promise instant justice, but the tone was different now. The system wasn't shrugging anymore. It was waking up. Back at the ranch that evening, I didn't feel helpless for the first time since coming home. I felt dangerous in a very specific way. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building a case. I set up folders, digital and physical, labeled everything. I made backups. I wrote down every conversation I'd had with the HOA, every vague answer, every refusal to explain. I started looking into zoning records and HOA boundaries, noting inconsistencies and gaps. The story I was telling myself changed too. This wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure. They thought my absence made me an easy target. They thought paperwork could erase accountability. They thought no one would connect the dots. Standing there at my kitchen table, cattle shifting uneasily outside, rain tapping against the windows, I understood the real mistake they'd made. They didn't just take my barn, they gave me proof. And from that moment on, this stopped being an emotional fight and became something far more dangerous for them. It became strategic. Once I accepted that what happened to me wasn't random, I couldn't unsee the signs. The footage, the receipts, the timing. It all pointed to something bigger than one barn. So I did the only thing that made sense. I started asking questions. I began with the properties closest to mine, the ones that still looked half out of place as the area grew more suburban. Working land, older structures, places that didn't fit the polished image the HOA liked to advertise. It didn't take long to find the first match. Lucas and Maribel Reyes lived less than 10 minutes away. Their property used to house a metal workshop where Lucas repaired farm equipment and took on custom fabrication jobs. When I pulled up, the slab was still there, just like mine. Clean, empty, too clean. Lucas told me the HOA had flagged his workshop as unsafe, citing minor cosmetic issues and community concerns. They gave him a short deadline to appeal and demanded a removal fee up front. He paid it, thinking compliance would buy time. Instead, demolition crews showed up days later. Tools vanished. Machines disappeared. The HOA told him it was all disposed of. Maribel showed me emails. The language was nearly identical to what Paula had used with me. Same phrases. Same vague authority. Same calm dismissal when they asked questions. A few days later, I met Naomi Park on the other side of Red Willow Plains. Her greenhouse operation had been her livelihood for more than a decade. Plants, climate systems, irrigation controls, everything was gone. The HOA told her the structure violated aesthetic guidelines and posed a safety risk. They demanded a removal fee and accelerated the timeline when she tried to appeal. She never got her equipment back either. What stood out wasn't just the losses, it was the pattern. Working properties, income-producing structures, owners who didn't live on site full-time or didn't have the resources to fight back. Every story followed the same script. Urgency, paperwork, pressure, demolition, silence. That's when I started digging into the contractors. The trucks in Frank's footage had a logo on the side that I hadn't paid much attention to before: Grayson Industrial Services. I searched public records, business filings, and county permits. The name jumped out immediately. Owner, Paul Grayson. The same last name wasn't a coincidence. A little more digging confirmed it. Paul Grayson was Paula Grayson's brother. Same mailing address, same family trust listed on older documents. And according to HOA financial statements, Grayson Industrial Services had been paid repeatedly over the past 2 years. Demolition contracts, cleanup fees, emergency removals. Everything snapped into place. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were clearing properties that didn't fit their vision, funneling the work to a family-owned contractor and profiting off the equipment that disappeared along the way. Safety was the excuse. Control was the goal. Money was the reward. By this point, my anger had transformed into something methodical. I stopped talking and started organizing. I collected statements from Lucas, Maribel, and Naomi, screenshots of emails, copies of invoices, HOA notices with matching language and formatting. Every document went into its own folder. The case was building itself. But I knew better than to walk into a courtroom alone. I contacted Rachel Monroe, a local attorney known for taking on regulatory abuse cases. When I laid everything out in her office, she didn't interrupt. She flipped through documents, watched the footage, and asked sharp, precise questions. When I finished, she leaned back and said something that finally confirmed I wasn't imagining any of this. "This isn't just an HOA dispute," she said. "This is fraud, theft, and abuse of authority." She explained how the lack of jurisdiction alone was a major problem for the HOA. Add in the missing permits, the family contractor link, and the auction receipts, and it became something far more serious. Not just civil liability, but potential criminal exposure. For the first time since coming home, I felt the balance shift. The HOA thought they were protected by paperwork. What they didn't realize was that patterns are louder than excuses. And once someone starts connecting them, the whole operation begins to collapse. As I left Rachel's office, I looked back at the ranch in my mind. The empty slab, the cattle in the rain, the quiet confidence Paula had carried in that office. I understood now why she had been so calm. She thought no one would ever compare notes. That was her mistake. And it was about to cost her everything. Once Rachel Monroe got involved, things started moving faster than the HOA expected. Within days, she arranged for a county inspection, and that was when the illusion Paula Grayson had been hiding behind finally cracked. County Inspector Daniel Hargrove arrived early in the morning, clipboard under his arm, boots already dusty from other sites. He didn't come with assumptions or attitudes. He came with maps, zoning records, and jurisdiction boundaries. We walked the property together, starting at the empty slab and moving outward, past the fence lines and markers my family had maintained for decades. Daniel didn't take long to reach his conclusion. My land was zoned agricultural. It had been that way long before the HOA existed. The barn was protected under grandfathered use, and the HOA had absolutely no authority to regulate, inspect, or demolish anything on it. Worse than that, there were no county permits pulled for the demolition. No environmental review, no safety authorization, nothing. In Daniel's words, from the county's perspective, this structure was removed illegally. Hearing it said out loud felt surreal. Everything Paula had claimed, every confident statement, every waived document collapsed into nothing more than noise. Daniel took photos, recorded measurements, and asked pointed questions about the timing of my deployment. Before he left, he told me he'd be filing a formal report and forwarding it to the appropriate offices. That should have been the end of Paula's confidence. Instead, she panicked. 2 nights later, just after 10 in the evening, headlights rolled slowly up my driveway. I stepped outside and saw Paula's vehicle followed by another truck I didn't recognize. A tall man stepped out wearing a black jacket with a security logo stitched onto the chest. Paula followed, holding a folder like it was a badge. She announced herself like she still had authority. Claimed there were environmental concerns. Alleged hazardous runoff. Said I was trespassing on community-managed land and interfering with remediation efforts. None of it made sense. None of it was real. I asked the security guard who hired him. He hesitated before answering. Paula jumped in, saying the HOA had approved his presence. I calmly explained that this was private agricultural property, that the HOA had no jurisdiction, and that a county inspector had already documented illegal action here. The guard looked uncomfortable. I could see it in the way he shifted his weight and avoided eye contact. He asked Paula if she had county authorization. She didn't answer him. Instead, she tried to talk over me, repeating buzzwords and phrases like ongoing investigation and community safety. I told the guard he was welcome to stay if he wanted to wait for the sheriff. Otherwise, he was trespassing. That was enough. He stepped back, apologized quietly, and returned to his truck without another word. Paula stood there alone, gripping her folder tighter, her confidence visibly cracking. She tried one last time to assert control, but her voice lacked conviction now. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff's office. Deputy Ryan Keller arrived within minutes. He listened as I explained what happened, then turned to Paula and asked her a simple question. Did she have legal authority to be there? She didn't. Deputy Keller issued her a formal warning for harassment and made it clear that further attempts to interfere with my property could result in charges. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that county records did not support her claims and that she needed to stay away. Paula didn't argue. She didn't threaten. She just got into her vehicle and left. As the taillights disappeared down the road, the reality of the situation finally settled in. This wasn't confidence anymore. This was desperation. She wasn't escalating because she was strong. She was escalating because she was cornered. The next few days were tense. I stayed on the property constantly, documenting everything. Rachel coordinated with county offices. Daniel Hargrove's report circulated. Word spread quietly through Red Willow Plains that something was wrong with the HOA's recent enforcement actions. I could feel the pressure building, like a storm waiting to break. Paula had lost her shield. The paperwork no longer protected her. Law enforcement had warned her. The county had documented violations, and she knew what I knew now, that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a gray area. It was illegal. Standing out there one evening, watching my cattle settle for the night, I understood the shift that had happened. For weeks, I had been reacting, scrambling, catching up to damage already done. Now, the momentum had flipped. Paula wasn't in control anymore. She was running out of places to hide, out of words to use, and out of time. And when someone like her realizes that, they don't back down quietly. They make mistakes. Big ones. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for a weeknight, rushed together so fast that half the residents didn't even know what they were walking into. The room was packed anyway. Folding chairs scraped against the floor, people whispered in uneasy clusters, and Paula Grayson stood at the front with a forced smile that didn't quite hide the strain around her eyes. I didn't sit down. I stood near the aisle with a thick folder under my arm and a flash drive in my pocket. Rachel Monroe sat a few rows behind me, calm and observant. County Inspector Daniel Hargrove leaned against the wall near the exit, clipboard in hand, quiet but unmistakably present. Paula opened the meeting with rehearsed language about community concerns and misunderstandings. She talked about rumors and misinformation. She framed everything as an overreaction caused by one unhappy homeowner. That was my cue. When the floor opened for comments, I walked to the front without asking permission. The room went silent. I introduced myself simply. Then I plugged the flash drive into the screen behind her. The first video played. You could hear the shift in the room immediately. The footage showed my barn doors opening, workers walking in calmly, and equipment being removed carefully, not destroyed. I paused the video and pointed things out slowly. The feed mixer, the tool cabinets, the veterinary storage, items that were supposedly disposed of. Then I switched to still images, auction receipts, dates highlighted, categories circled. I explained how the items matched what was taken from my property and how the auctions occurred days after the demolition. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I just laid it out. Next came the payments. HOA financial records, checks written to Grayson Industrial Services, repeated contracts over multiple months, emergency removals, cleanup fees. I let the room connect the dots before I said the name. Paul Grayson. Paula's brother. The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Angry murmurs. Someone stood up and demanded to know why a family-owned contractor was receiving so much HOA money. Paula tried to interrupt, but her words stumbled over each other. For the first time since I had met her, she sounded unsure. That was when Daniel Hargrove stepped forward. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't accuse. He simply stated facts. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. No permits were pulled. No environmental reviews conducted. No legal authority exercised. He informed the room that multiple properties were now under county review and that referrals for prosecution were being prepared. You could feel the room tilt. Then another blow landed. The HOA's insurance representative, attending by phone, addressed the board. After reviewing the evidence, the carrier was denying coverage related to these demolitions. Intentional acts, abuse of authority, and conflicts of interest voided protection. That meant personal liability. Paula didn't sit down after that. She just stood there staring at the table like it had betrayed her. Board members whispered urgently among themselves. Someone called for a vote. Another demanded her resignation outright. It didn't take long. Paula was removed as president in front of everyone she once controlled. No applause. No shouting. Just a stunned silence as her authority evaporated in real time. She gathered her papers with shaking hands and walked out without looking at anyone. I watched her leave and felt something unexpected. Relief, not triumph, not joy. Just the quiet satisfaction of watching truth catch up to someone who thought it never would. The meeting dissolved shortly after. People clustered around me asking questions. Others apologized for not speaking up sooner. A few admitted they had been afraid. I told them I understood. Fear works when it's isolated. Outside, the air felt lighter. Rachel stepped beside me and said the words I had been waiting to hear. They can't bury this now. Driving home, I passed the empty slab again. It didn't feel as heavy anymore. The damage was still there. The loss was still real. But the lie had collapsed in public, and that mattered. Paula Grayson had built her power on confidence and paperwork, on the belief that no one would challenge her story. That night, in a crowded room under fluorescent lights, her version of reality fell apart piece by piece, and everyone saw it happen. The courtroom was quiet, in a way that felt heavier than any shouting match I had imagined. Wood benches. Muted light. Everyone sitting still, waiting for someone else to speak first. I stood beside Rachel Monroe at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, eyes forward. Across the aisle, the HOA's remaining board members sat stiffly, flanked by their attorney. Paula Grayson wasn't there. I wasn't surprised. Judge Harold Whitman listened without interruption as Rachel laid everything out: the lack of jurisdiction, the missing permits, the footage showing careful removal of equipment, the auction receipts, the payments to a family-owned contractor, the livestock exposure, the business losses. Every piece of evidence fit together like it had always belonged in the same story. When it was their turn, the HOA's attorney tried to frame it as a mistake. Poor communication. Overzealous enforcement. He spoke carefully, avoiding words like demolition and theft, leaning heavily on phrases like misunderstanding and good faith. Judge Whitman didn't seem impressed. He asked a few direct questions, simple ones. Who authorized the demolition? Under what jurisdiction? Where the permits were? Why equipment listed as disposed appeared in auctions days later? Each answer dug the hole deeper. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was calm but decisive. He ruled in my favor without hesitation. The order was clear and unforgiving. The Homeowners Association was required to rebuild my barn to its exact original specifications. Same footprint, same function, same capacity. The deadline was 90 days. For every day beyond that deadline, the HOA would face daily contempt fines that would continue until compliance was complete. He also awarded damages, compensation for livestock exposure, veterinary costs, emergency shelter expenses, business interruption, lost use of equipment. Not a symbolic amount, a real one. As the ruling was read into the record, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding on to since the day I came home. This wasn't sympathy. This was accountability. Construction started within weeks. The county oversaw every step. Inspectors documented measurements. Materials were approved in advance. Timelines were enforced. This wasn't a flexible project. It was a court-mandated correction. I was there every day, watching the foundation get poured, the framing go up, the roof take shape. Not because I didn't trust the workers, but because I understood how much this build represented. This wasn't just about restoring a structure. It was about restoring a line that should never have been crossed. Halfway through the process, Paula's attorney reached out. He wanted to talk about practical adjustments, smaller modifications, cost-saving alternatives, slight changes that would still, in his words, meet the spirit of the order. I told him no, not rudely, not emotionally, just no. The order didn't say equivalent. It didn't say reasonable alternative. It said exact specifications. The judge had been clear. Any deviation, no matter how minor, opened the door to contempt penalties. I wasn't interested in helping them cut corners after everything they had done. The call ended quickly after that. As the barn took form again, people from the community started stopping by. Some to apologize, some to watch quietly. Others just to see what accountability looked like when it was written in concrete and lumber instead of emails and excuses. The cattle were the last to move back in. I waited until the doors were hung, the feed systems installed, and the shelter was ready. When they finally stepped inside, calm and unbothered, it felt like the ranch exhaled for the first time in months. Paula never came by again. Her name stopped appearing in emails. Her authority ended the moment the court order was issued, and she knew better than to test it. Standing there in the finished space, I ran my hand along a beam that matched the original dimensions exactly. Same placement, same purpose. Different meaning. They thought destroying something while I was gone would erase it quietly. Instead, they rebuilt it under the weight of the law, with every mistake documented and corrected. The barn stood again, not just as a structure, but as proof that paper authority only works until it meets real scrutiny. And this time, it didn't survive. I stood inside the rebuilt barn as the cattle moved back in one by one, calm and unbothered for the first time in months. The sound of hooves on solid ground echoed off the walls, and it felt like the ranch finally took a full breath again. The beams were new, the roof was solid, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. But this building wasn't just wood and steel. It was accountability made physical. A few weeks earlier, the new HOA board held a public meeting right here in town. They apologized openly, not just to me, but to everyone who had been affected. They promised reforms, oversight, and transparency. Whether they meant it or not was up to time, but the damage they inherited made one thing clear. Abuse doesn't stay hidden forever. Looking back, I didn't win because I was louder than them. I didn't win because I was angrier. I won because I documented everything. I verified who actually had authority. I followed the money when the words stopped making sense. Fake authority only works when people stay silent and isolated. If you're dealing with an HOA that's pushing boundaries, remember this. Paper doesn't outrank property rights. Confidence doesn't replace jurisdiction. And rules don't become law just because someone repeats them often enough. I learned that the hard way, but I also learned something better. When you stay calm, gather proof, and refuse to be intimidated, even the most confident bully eventually runs out of places to hide. And if my story sounds familiar, you're not alone. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?